Hello viewers. So today we'll see what are the best practices that we should be following in case of Docker. So if you are using Docker, then what are the best practices for using Docker that we'll see today. So let's get started. So Docker development best practices says CI/CD for testing and deployment. Expert recommends using Docker Hub or any other CI/CD pipeline to build and tag a Docker image whenever a pull request is created. Furthermore, the image should be signed by the development, security, and testing team before they are pushed to the production so that it is constantly tested for quality by the desired team. Second important thing is use of different environments for development and testing. One of the best practices while using Docker for development is creating different testing and development environments. Doing so will allow the developer to keep the Docker files isolated and execute them without influencing the final build after testing. And third is update Docker to the latest version. Before you begin working on a Docker project, you need to ensure that you update the Docker to the latest version. Even though it will not directly impact the project, it will provide you with that the Docker has to offer. No updates also have certain security features safeguarding the projects from the potential attack. Frequent backup a single manager nodes. A common Docker best practice says that a Docker container is to back a single managed node frequently, which helps admins in restoration. Docker Swarm and Universal Control Panel data are part of every node, so backing up a single manager node can get the job done for the admins. Cloud deployment for a Docker container. So when deploying a Docker container to a cloud, both Amazon Web Service and Microsoft Azure do not have integrated host optimized for Docker. They use the Kubernetes cluster for deployment. A standard virtual machine should be created by the admins who prefer to deploy a single container. Apart from that, securing the secure socket cell and installing Docker is the next step. Admins cannot deploy the application on a cloud after installing Docker. Next best practice is control Docker containers through a load balancer. A load balancer helps admin to get good control over the Docker containers, which helps them in making containers highly available and scalable. The most commonly used load balancer is Nginx, which can easily be installed on the Docker. So load balancer helps in balancing the loads, static and dynamic caching, rate limiting, and multiple distinct applications. Another best practice is use of official Docker images as possible. So do not use use the official images. Next best practice is beware of the inheritance and dependency. Your containers inherit a parent image that generally includes all the operating system dependencies, things like dependent packages, default users, etc. Those inherited attributes and dependencies might expose your container to unnecessary risk. Make sure you are aware of the inherited attributes and take any additional step necessary to further isolate and protect your container. Next is limit container interaction. Container security has emerged as a serious concern for many organizations, specifically how containers interact with one another and with the outside world. Your container should not accept connections on exposed ports through any network interface. You should take steps both to control how and how much containers interact with each other internally and limit the number of containers that have content with the outside world so you can minimize exposure to the external links. You should also monitor containers for vulnerabilities. One of the challenges of using a code-based repository like Docker Hub is that once a container image is uploaded to the repository, nobody takes responsibility for keeping patched and secure. It might be fine with the originally created, but over time, new vulnerabilities and exploits are discovered and you need to scan for those before using containers in production. A tool like Twistlog can help you monitor for and identify vulnerabilities in your container images. Next is run containers and as read-only where possible. One of the best and simple way to limit exposure to risk for container is to run them in read-only mode. That obviously won't work for all the containers. There will be containers that must accept input of some sort in order for app to work, but containers that can be run in read-only mode should be. You should also never run containers in privileged mode. Now let's see what are some of the best practice for Docker logging. So logging from application. So Docker logging directly from the application is a method where application within the container manages the logging through the framework. The developers will have the utmost control over the logging event when using this method. Logging drivers. Logging drivers is a unique feature for Docker that helps read data by the std error or std out streams of the container as they are specifically configured to accomplish this task. Once done, the host machine stores log files that include the prior data. Dedicated container for logging. Having a dedicated container for logging helps in eradicating dependencies on the host machine. This container will be responsible for log file management within the Docker environment. Sidecar method. The sidecar method is undoubtedly among the best if you want to manage microservices architecture. Here, the sidecar runs simultaneously with the parent application where they share the same network and volume. These shared resources allow you to expand the app functionalities and eradicate the need to install any extra configurations. Use docker ignore to explicitly exclude files and folders. So for the security, let's have the prefer minimal base images. Use the list privilege users. Sign and verify image to mitigate the MITM attack. Find, fix and monitor for open source vulnerabilities. Don't leak sensitive information to the Docker images. Use fixed tag for immutability. Use copy instead of add. Use labels for metadata. Use multi-stage build for smaller secure images. Use a linter. Docker files. When using containers to deploy your application, one of the most important things that we should do, you must get right, is your Docker files. Docker files are how you tell Docker what to build, how to deploy containers. If they are not well written or optimized for your needs, that can significantly impact how quickly and efficiently you can get new versions of your application up and running. So what are some of the best practices for Docker files? Within Docker files, do not use your Docker files as a build script. A Docker file is a set of instructions that can be used to create a custom image. It should never be used as a build script because it will make your build unnecessarily long. When you must compile or bundle software in your Docker file, you should use the add instruction. This will copy the file necessary for compilation into image before it starts running commands. This will let you keep the Docker file short and manage any dependencies required for compilation separately from Docker file. Use env to define environment variables. Setting environment variable is a best practice for Docker file. Although it might seem like a small detail, defining your environment variable will make your containers more portable. This is because your environment variables are the only thing that can change from one execution to the next. If you have a variable that must be different both inside and outside of container, then you must define it using env. Next best practice related to Docker file is commit your Docker files to the repository. One of the best practices for Docker file is committing them to your repository. This lets you easily and quickly reference it later without remembering all of the commands that you use or what their order was. Next is be mindful of your base image and its size. One of the most important things to consider when creating a Docker file is the base image that you are using. It will increase your Docker image size if you have a lot of extraneous code. This will make it much slower for your container to start up, or even worse, prevent it from starting at all. The best way to avoid this is by being mindful of which package and scripts you use. If it does not seem necessary to include it in the base image, try and find a way to install it when the container starts up instead. This will save space on your container, thus making it run more quickly and efficiently. Do not expose secrets. This is another best practice. Never share or copy the application credential or any sensitive information in the Docker file. Instead, use the doc ignore file to prevent the copying files that might contain sensitive information. The doc-ignore file acts as the equivalent to the get-ignore file and lets you specify the file that you want the build process to ignore. Be mindful of what ports are exposed. When designing your Docker file, make sure that you know what ports are exposed by. By default, Docker will expose all of the containers to a range of random internal ports. This is problematic as it can expose critical services to the outside world and leave them open for attack. If you are using a service that must be exposed to the public internet, then you must create an entry in the Docker file. This is done by adding expose in your Docker file. Make use of multi-stage build as well. This is another best practice. So next best practice is versioning Docker images. A common practice among Docker users is using the latest tag for images, which is also the default tag for images. Using the tag will eradicate the possibility of identifying the running version code based on the image tag. Not only does it become easier to overwrite it, but it also leads to extreme complications while doing the rollbacks. Make sure to avoid using the latest tag, especially for base image. as it could unintentionally lead to the deployment of a new version. Rather than using the default tag, the latest best practice is to use descriptors like semantic version, timestamps, or Docker image IDs as tag. With the practice of having a relevant tagging scheme, it becomes easier to tie the tag to the code. Next best practice is avoid storing secrets in image and the use of environment variable. Environment variables are primarily used to keep the application flexible and secure. And see, we should avoid storing secrets in the image because it can lead. We should not expose this to the outside world. Using Docker file ignore, we have seen already. Image linting and scanning. Inspecting the source code for any stylistic or programmatic errors that can cause is called lining. Linting can help ensure that Docker files comply with the right practice and can be maintained. This process can also be followed in image to determine any underlying issues. And use the Docker ignore file to define the required builds context. Before an image is built, the user has to specify the files and folders that should be excluded from the initial build context sent to the Docker daemon, which is done with the help of Docker ignore file. So thank you so much for watching today's video, and if you think the videos are helpful, do like the video and subscribe to the channel.